Joining me on this episode of the Neil Wilkins podcast, I'm delighted to welcome a very special guest. Now, when I say special guest, I really do mean it. John Graham is a three-time USA memory champion and has a whole host of services and skills and experience to share with us on the topic, the very pertinent, very hot topic today in business and in life in general, of releasing panic attacks and anxiety. So we're going to go very deep and we're going to keep this episode very, very raw because for a lot of us, this is a fundamental challenge in not only business, but in living. So hopefully we're going to uncover a lot of techniques, a lot of approaches, and John's going to help us and guide us through the whole concept of release and opening ourselves up to, I'm guessing, a little bit of vulnerability. So welcome to the podcast, John.
Neil, happy to be here. Happy to crack that open for people and offer like a really rich new perspective that probably will surprise people.
And I think it is that element of surprise which has really drawn me to kind of, really looking forward to this episode of recording with you, John, because there's a very different approach that you're taking. I know a lot of people who sort of claim to be able to, help people with anxiety and with any kind of, let's call them mental health issues, which I think a lot of people are identifying that they have right now, go straight either for medication, for techniques, for meditation, etc., etc. Your approach is very, very different. Do you want to give us a little bit of a flavor as to why it's so different?
Yeah, well, my experience comes from living it. Probably decades of anxiety on and off, like height, it's like a roller coaster. It comes, it goes, it comes stronger. And then to the point where I was having daily panic attacks, like multiple. It was awful. And my approach comes from, this is labeled as mental health, right? Right off the bat. So that means, we must treat it with the mind. The way to overcome it is through the mind, right? Makes sense. Well, in fact, the root issue is emotional. So treating it with the mind is limited and won't ever get to the real root of it. And I tried all of the things that people are trying, medication, Xanax, hydroxyzine, all of those things, meditations, guided meditations, focusing on your breath, transcendental meditation, you name it. Supplements, thinking, I have brain fog, I must need a supplement, I'm deficient in something. Hypnosis, therapy, all the reframes, all the digging, all the like patterns, all the subconscious, right? None of that worked. None of that got to the root of it because it was only it's an illusion that it's working. Because one day you do a tool, a technique, and it's gone. Oh, I feel great. And then it's like you kick the can down the road. So you walk 2 more days and then the can's right there and it's stronger. It's like it didn't go away. And so I said, okay, this clearly isn't working. Like to the root, to the depth. I want this gone for good, like forever. And in that search and that seeking, I realized after 20 years of like trying all the mental stuff, idolizing my mind, it's not working. So realizing very quickly it's an emotional root issue. And once you realize that, you can get to the depth of it and really resolve it.
This is really, really interesting. And I think that whole challenge of the norm, I guess, as you say, John, because I mean, a lot of us will have been trying these techniques. I mean, I've spent many, many years kind of going through this word mindfulness. And I know it's almost become a cliche now that, it is very much something that we challenge ourselves with, that deep understanding of self. And, we practice all these various techniques, and there are many gurus, let's call them that, who, will take you through various programs and courses and approaches. And you do find, I guess, a deeper understanding of yourself, but it doesn't really attend to the fundamental blockage, I guess, which is probably what you were finding. Is it that, you're almost sort of releasing yourself from something? There's something almost tethering and kind of holding you and locking you in place that no amount of techniques are going to solve, because all they're doing is they're kind of dancing around it and playing with it. Mm-hmm. Is there something in that?
Yeah, here's the real root. Everyone does this. There's moments in our lives that we can't handle because of the emotion. It's intense. Embarrassment in 3rd grade when everyone laughed at you. A heartbreak. Someone cut you off in traffic. Like these moments that are just so intense with emotion, even if they're not that intense, we push them away. We try to distract ourselves from that or feel better. Every time we do that, those moments, if left unprocessed, they're still inside of us. Throughout our whole life, they accumulate. They trap in our body, in our cell, in our nervous system. These are suppressed emotions. So they stack and stack and stack, right? And so we try to resolve it with our mind through force or control of avoiding certain things or wanting certain things. And that's the route that doesn't work. The only way is in release. Release just means we crack this stuff open. We allow these suppressed emotions to open up, which are very uncomfortable, as you can imagine, and we let them happen. And that's really as simple as I can make it. We allow our emotions to flow through us, to process out all of the stuff that's currently going on, all the stuff from the past. And the more you do that, not only are you releasing emotion, but you're expanding your capacity to handle life. Like, I'll label it as, people all want peak performance, right? And I did too, right? We want to achieve our goals. We want peak performance. We want to perform better. Well, think of peak performance as like, see this like water mug, right? This is your capacity. You can't handle any more life, like voltage, life force, whatever you want to call it, energy. And so we try to use our mind to manipulate and stack this energy and to perform. But every time we run into a limit, because we can't hold any more than this. Anytime life overflows beyond this, we get overwhelmed, we shut down, we get exhausted, right? But when you start releasing the suppressed emotions, what you're doing is you're cracking open this dense pockets of energy that are trapped in you. You're releasing energy, which is expanding your capacity to handle life. You're embodying more and more capacity for energy. So in this work, like, see the old way of performance of like manipulating my mind, trying to get what I want, you're limited in your capacity. But if you do this inner work of releasing, integrating, you expand your capacity, you have more energy, you make easier changes, things happen naturally for you instead of like forcing everything. So it's a very, very deep process, but that's really what's going on.
I'd not made that link actually between. Well, obviously, I hadn't made the link between the emotion and the anxiety necessarily. But it's interesting that you talk about this kind of energy capacity. I know that Caroline Mason and a number of others talk about the energy bank account, don't they? Where there's this kind of almost this 100% sort of obviously capacity, and even if you start the day with good intentions, if you've got this baggage that is already eating into that energy bank account, because 10% of it might be preconceived ideas, another 10% might be something you brought from yesterday, another 10% might be sort of childhood stuff, another 10%. So you're starting in deficit already even before you start the day, and then you load in stuff that's going to be happening in that day, a big presentation, the big pitch to a particular client, that really intense meeting that you've been struggling to prepare for over weeks and weeks in advance. And suddenly then you're going to be full to bursting, aren't you? Is this kind of where people are just expecting too much over this kind of performance load that you talk about?
Yeah, it's a great example. I'm like, the way you're describing it is exact, right? Let's give an example here. Like, you see an email that you don't like. Something happens in your life you don't want to handle. Immediately, all of your attention and your mind and all of your emotions are flooded onto that, right? Which drains and ripples out. Like, not only are you draining your energy of your focus and awareness, but you're leaking your energy, right? Because all that emotion goes into that. And then the mind starts wondering, how do I fix this? What do I do, right, to try to resolve it? So then you're constantly just draining your energy. That's what anxiety is. You're trying to figure out with your mind how to handle the future to avoid that feeling, right? The feeling, the emotion, the sensation really is the anxiety, not the mind. The mind follows to try to figure out and avoid that uncomfortable feeling, right? So if we, instead of, and again, here's a really big hack or tip here, instead of pushing away that feeling or try to figure out how to avoid that feeling, lean into that feeling, because that's your growth. That's your expansion, is to allow that to flow through you and out instead of resisting it, because that resistance is what perpetuates it and keeps us in it.
That's really interesting. I think, one of the things that you've, for me, highlighted there is just this game, I guess, that our mind is playing in a situation like that, because it feels that the mind, I mean, let's face it, our minds are incredible things. I mean, they open up opportunities to innovate, to explore ideas, to kind of, work with our intuition, etc., etc. I mean, they're incredible things that make us human, but they can be an absolute pain at other times, can't they? Because they almost get in the way, and we start then to overthink, and then we start to complicate. And I guess for a lot of people, that's where they would say, in a situation like that, that's emotionally charged, is, well, my mind starts racing. And I know for a lot of us who have to do, big ticket presentations, and it's, you've done the breathing, you've done the preparation, you know your pitch, the story you're going to tell, and then suddenly the mind cuts in, and then you start to forget to breathe, and you start to then kind of almost clam up, and then you get that thing of brain fog, and it's like, oh no, the mind did it again. We're often our own worst enemy, aren't we, if we let the mind kind of jump in and just sort of take over? Is it about just being patient with ourselves? Because it feels like we're trying to almost race ahead to find a solution here, whereas you talk about leaning into it. That feels almost sort of giving up responsibility and accountability and not trying to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Not figuring it out is the biggest thing we can do, which is completely counterintuitive, because this feeling is so uncomfortable. We try to figure out how to get rid of it, right? Notice the breathing. The breathing is our mind forcing it out. We're trying to manipulate it out. Force, right? All these techniques, reframing the thought to make it positive, is using your mind's force to push it away. And all of that, we're trying to push it away, which is actually creating resistance. Well, let's talk about the ego for a second. The ego, the mind, is a construct that we all live in, right? Most strongly from the age of 0 to 7. We are in a theta brainwave. We're like a sponge. Our brain is a sponge, so we form a structure of the world. Our beliefs, what we hear from our parents, the way things are, forms a structure of the world. So all of this becomes like the voice in our head, guiding us. So the ego, the mind, is not a bad thing, right? But it limits us. It keeps us in this comfortability of familiar. So everyone has a different familiarity zone. The mind is always trying to keep you in that, to keep you safe. That's why anytime you try to go outside of it, you get resistance, right? Because it's uncomfortable. Your mind's trying to protect you, right? But the way you expand your capacity is not through the mind, not trying to always convince it of a different belief, or always trying to feel grateful, or always trying to reframe everything, or trying to force yourself to breathe in a certain way to reach a certain state. That helps in some instances. The way is to lean into the feeling, the energy that's there outside of the mind, because there's more intelligence in that energy than there is in our mind. Like, I give this example a lot. My wife, we just had a baby. My wife didn't make that baby. She didn't think, oh, I need to force and create the arms today and do a breathing technique, or I need to visualize its heart beating, or she didn't do any of that. She ate food, she rested, and her body and intelligence formed that child. Like, right? Same thing with our heart. Our heart pumps blood and does all these things, right? Without our mind. Yet we as humans try to force everything, not realizing there's a divine intelligence beyond our mind that's actually trying to help us and act holistically and naturally. But we get in the way so many times with that construct of the ego. We try to achieve certain things and creates a lot of resistance.
Isn't it interesting that when you describe it like that, that actually the simplest route is almost to do nothing? And yet what do we do as humans? We start to complicate it. We start to try and add to the storytelling. We start to, kind of feel like we can figure this out. But actually doing nothing, apart from just leaning, as you say, into that emotion, into that feeling, it's quite profoundly simple. I mean, there is nothing more simple than just letting it happen, just going with the flow, just easing yourself into it and doing nothing. Why is doing nothing the hardest thing to do? Because that's counterintuitive too, isn't it?
Yeah, because the mind is the way the mind survives and keeps you in the construct is by doing. That's why we're always buzzing and feeling like we need to do something or think about something or move forward. It's because that's what the mind believes we need, right? To always have an outcome, to always get what we want, to be happy. We're always seeking. And let's even go deeper here. Why do we always try to do something? Why do we always try to get what we want? We do it because of the feeling it will give us. We're always seeking to feel good or to avoid what doesn't feel good. But I can tell you that pursuit doesn't work. Because if you win, like I'm a 3-time US champion, the last trophy I won, I wanted another one. It never ends. You always want more coffee. You always want more money. You always want more love. You always want more this. So you try to seek it because the mind tries to seek it. That's what it's trying to do, is keep you familiar, keep you comfortable, keep you happy. And that pursuit doesn't work. It's not sustainable. So we have to realize my mind is always trying to get me to do something, to reach an outcome, to feel happy. And you have to wake up at some point, like I did. I mean, maybe you don't have to, but you realize, oh my gosh, I'm just in a hamster wheel of outcomes and doing and doing and doing. But like you said, being is different than doing. Being is when you let the mind go, let it do what it wants. You let the emotions do what it wants. And in that state, in that presence, you're powerful because you're allowing life to happen, and you're allowing that intelligence to flow through you and expand, versus like trying to use your human mind to manipulate the world and get what you want. And so it takes awareness. Like you talked about mindfulness. Like the first stage is being aware of this, being mindful of this, accepting this, right? But now the next stage is to go deeper, to allow all of it, allow all the uncomfortability, and to move beyond the mind. Because your greatest expansion, I tell my clients this all the time, your greatest expansion is beyond your mind. I was the same way. I always glorified my mind. I thought my mind was the final frontier. If I could master this mind, I could manifest what I want. I could get what I want. I could achieve. And it's true, you can achieve. But your greatest expansion is beyond this construct, this limited construct of your mind. Because your mind is limited. It is programmed. As wonderful as I think my mind is, it's operating under conditioning and programming. And the only way to overcome that conditioning and programming is to not use your mind to overcome it, but to allow all of this suppressed energy to flow and to happen and to expand you.
So it feels then, and I'll say feels rather than thinks, because I really need to be going with the heart here, and this is all about the feeling, not the overjudging. But it feels then, John, like what you're describing here then is almost, I've got to do a deal with my mind to kind of get it to accept, to move out of the way just for a moment, to let this stuff happen. Because I think for a lot of us, our mind is in control. It might be the body, but the body's probably supported by the mind making the decisions as to, let's go and do a workout, let's take a rest day, etc., etc. It's the mind that's kind of going to drive it, maybe push it a little bit too hard for this peak performance that you're talking about. If I go with the heart thing, that can often be, well, okay, it's a lovely feeling, and yes, I love that emotion, but come on, let's not trust the heart, because the mind's a lot more technical and competent. So it's kind of, the mind's almost like bigging itself up and playing beyond its scope and its range by the way you're defining it here. So how do we negotiate then with the mind to just allow it to say, okay, just for this moment, I'm going to step out of the way. I'm not going to try and dominate. Is the word vulnerability, because it feels like there's a single word here that might describe what you're describing. Is it the word vulnerability? Is it to almost convince the mind it's okay, let's just be vulnerable for a moment?
Yeah, the way I see vulnerability is just your capacity to handle and speak truth. Because people think vulnerability means weakness, right? And I got that. I was the same way. Like, vulnerable. I don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want to share my deep, dark secrets. but it's beyond that. It's truth. You talk about the mind, you talk about the brain, right? The way I am describing it is we, especially in the West, have conditioned our minds to be over dominant. That's really what it is. It's like we need our mind. We use our mind. It's not a bad thing, but it's an over dominance. So it's coming into harmony, right? Not relying 100% on your mind to do everything in that control, which it is control. People don't realize this, and I didn't realize this either, that the heart has memories. The heart stores memories, and the heart does lead if you let it, right? Which can be vulnerable and scary, because the mind, we've always used our mind our whole life. Most of us for 30 some 40 some years, however old you are, used our mind to navigate this world, because that's what we're taught. The heart holds the memories that are causing all of the barriers in your life, not your mind. So what do I mean by that? The reason we're so over dominant in our mind, because our heart is so walled off and so guarded. Think of all the betrayals you've had in your life, or the embarrassments, or the heartbreaks. Those are very painful moments. Even just any type of negative emotional event scars the heart. The heart remembers it. The heart has a memory. That's why when you approach certain people or see a car of someone you used to date, it brings back a feeling instantly. It's because you're holding on to that. Your heart remembers. And so in this work, you are neutralizing the polarization of the heart. So the more you lean into these feelings, the more you let them process out and release, you're neutralizing that polarization of the heart, that feeling. Which means now the cloud, the wall is dissolving to allow your heart to guide you more and more, because it's not a scarred heart anymore. After you've done this work, it's open, right? You talked about a moment of earlier, you said, like, when we're in that, we need our mind when we're inspired, when creativity flows. When you're in that zone, it means your heart is open. There's no self-sabotaging behaviors that your heart, or memories that are causing your heart to cause you to procrastinate or feel apathy or feel down, right? Your heart is open. So the more you do this work, you dissolve those barriers, you dissolve that polarization, the memories of your heart that are causing all the self-sabotaging behaviors and bad habits, right? And we open up our heart. We're guided more by that feeling, versus the always constant thinking, overthinking, marinating on, ruminating, and trying to figure out the best way to navigate life. So simply stated, it's a harmonization between heart and brain. Instead of letting the head lead all the time, you're dissolving, you're harmonizing that balance. They have to work together, but your heart is leading the way, and then the mind is working in tandem with it.
That's a really interesting one, because it just reminded me, actually, the way you described that, of a few years back in a particular workshop that my wife and I attended, and the leader of the workshop, very, very, very intuitive lady, and we often talk about her. She kind of pops into conversation over dinner as we're kind of discussing life and the universe and everything, and she actually said at some point, "Neil, I think it's about time you let your heart sing." And at the time, I didn't really understand kind of what she meant. I was on a bit of a different journey. I was, exploring other things. And it's only really recently that that's actually really made sense to me, this whole idea. And it's not the literal singing in the literal sense, but it's just let your heart sing to yourself. It's not let your heart kind of pour out emotions and sing and, be joyous and vocalize and things like that. Although it might be, I don't know. But that's not kind of what she meant. It was metaphorically, let your heart sing, give it a voice at the table. So when your body and your mind, which are totally in cahoots for, kind of dominating every decision, everything that you do, all the choices that you make, all the behaviors that you exhibit, it's all about your mind and your body. Just let your heart sing. So I think what you're saying there, John, is actually something that I've been told And actually, when I've kind of recognized that and just allowed myself to be a little bit more vulnerable, not just always put up this facade of being absolutely perfect,
Sure.
because that's what I've been trained to be, because I'm a business professional. Therefore, I've got to be absolutely unbreakable and every decision's got to be correct. It's about saying, hey, I don't know anything, really. I don't really know anything. And all I'm doing is just doing my best.
Yeah.
And just opening up to that vulnerability, that honesty, that openness. And I love your phrase there. I'm just going to really resonate with me. This whole thing about just leaning into it. It feels so natural when you actually give yourself permission to do it and just take everything out of the way, and that ego thing that you talked about. Once you can just put those things aside, not that you're kind of almost losing them, but you're just giving them a space to just take a little bit of a pause, take a time out for a moment, and just let your heart come through and just see
Yeah.
what happens. Is this where we're going with this? This whole kind of releasing it feels like it's very heart centered.
It's very hard. It's opening your heart, right? Your guidance, which your heart is magnitudes more powerful in guidance than your mind. And I understand if people don't get that yet. I had the same moment as you with someone, open your heart, live in your heart. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, how do I do that? What are the steps? So in my head, this process, especially for people who are listening, who have lots of resistance, lots of anxiety, lots of brain fog, lots of dread, lots of overthinking, paralysis, procrastination, all of that is an emotional root issue. Very simply, we have a lot of blocked emotions in the way, inside, that we're trapped, right? Using this process of leaning in, and the process I go deep of helping people really release this stuff. The more you do that, the static clears, the heart opens. You don't have these like negatively charged heart memories that are causing you to shut down and avoid, right? Because you talk about vulnerability. Why do we hide ourselves? It's a heart memory. It's shame, because we've been taught and conditioned that if I show this part of me that likes space and astronauts and aliens, that people will laugh at me. So I hide that part of me. Or if I show this part of me that's more aggressive and dominant, people will call me names and think I'm manipulative or whatever. And so I shut that part of me down. So we don't open up. We're not vulnerable. We're not real. We're a mask, right? That's all heart memory. So the more we dissolve these barriers, like, you can see how vulnerable I am and real on this podcast. I wouldn't have done this in my anxiety, right? I wouldn't have dared share any of this, but because I've dissolved and I'm not worried about this feeling anymore, right? I'm able to open up. So you are opening up your heart. You're more real. You're more powerful. You're more decisive. You're more clear. You're not rippling out and leaking your energy everywhere, right? And you're expanding. You talk about intuition too. Heart is more of a feel guiding you. I just gave this example to a client. I think a lot of people resonate. Think of all the bad habits you've tried to overcome in your life. Like, stop watching the news, eat better, go work out. We're kind of taught to like force ourselves to do these things. Force yourself to make your bed. Force yourself to read a chapter a night. Force yourself to whatever in the morning. Like, have a morning routine. It's all force. And we stop. We break our resolutions. We go back to old habits. Why is that? It's because forced using your mind doesn't work. The way that you naturally feel more called to better habits, or you feel the bad taste of bad habits, is by doing this work. Because my client, just spoke with her an hour ago. She's like, all of a sudden I just feel disgusted by the news. All of a sudden I feel disgusted by this food I was eating. All of a sudden I just feel like I need to work out. It's like a feeling, it's a calling. She feels magnetically pulled to it instead of like forcing herself to do it. So she's naturally doing it because she's cracking all of this stuff open inside of her that was once suppressed. So you see, the mind likes to force. The release moves everything out of the way so that we can feel our way and intuit our way through life, which is much more powerful, much more sustainable and natural.
Is this heart coherence then? Because I know there's a lot of research, and the likes of Greg Braden and others talk about this 0.1 hertz of the resonance of the planet, basically, and that if we can get our heart coherence kind of resonating with something much bigger than ourselves, then we're in that kind of space where we can tap into those opportunities, because there is this greater energy, this greater power. Coming back to your sort of energy account sort of analogy there, it kind of feels that we can tap into something that's way bigger than just my little 100% that I've got available every day. If I can tap into this almost infinite resource, then wow, what are the opportunities? This feels so much bigger than just us as individuals, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's tapping into that still point where the heart is open. The mind is like the mind and the heart are working in tandem. They're not fighting each other. But really simply, to give context for this, give an example for this, right? You talk about this infinite potential, right? And it's true. But what does that really mean? Well, everyone here has gotten an idea, a brilliant idea when they've been in the shower or riding on the bus, that downloaded in, or they woke up. In a moment of inspiration, they had a profound idea come in, like literally come into their mind. Where did that come from? That came from that great expansive field, right? It didn't come from your brain. It downloaded in from beyond. That's what we're talking about. So the more you can release the static and the blockages in the way of your heart and live in that still point, that neutral point, the creativity is on tap. You don't have to like force yourself to write good copy or force yourself to say something powerful. It comes in when it needs to. Like another example is a lot of my clients, even me, come to me because they want to memorize something perfectly or they want to have a great speech, right? And they want to force themselves to memorize something word for word in a meeting or a presentation to be perfect, right? That you talk about perfection. But that is so limiting and so in the head and so like nerve-wracking that you're afraid you're going to miss a word, that you don't speak your brilliance. Like right now, I don't have any notes in front of me, but I'm tapped into this moment and like stuff is just pouring out. You talk about a concept, it comes out, brilliance comes out. Something I've never said before maybe happened in this podcast. That's what we're talking about. That when the heart and the mind are working together, when the mind is more still and the heart is leading, like you're more vulnerable, you're more open. That stuff comes through. Those ideas that you want in business or in marketing, they're going to come through. They always do when you're in this state and you're not forcing it or struggling or in a state of friction or frustration.
So actually, this is a really interesting point now then that you're making. So it's kind of, once we've let the heart sing, to use my phrase, we've kind of let the mind just take a little backward seat, take a bit of a time out. Are we now letting it back in? Because it feels then, to get this almost correct balance, to allow the mind to do what it's very good at, but under kind of certain rules or certain kind of, let's call it, restrictions. So we're holding it back a little bit so that the heart can kind of lead and guide, but the mind comes in and gives it the best of itself. Is that the perfect space? Because you have this incredible ability with memory, and yet you're vulnerable, and yet you're very open, and you're very heart driven. How does that balance kind of work? Because I can imagine there are people listening to this thinking, yeah, John, that's great, really loving the sound of all of this and tapping into this higher power and this higher kind of creative source, if you like. That's brilliant. But actually, I do want to think about stuff. I don't want to just give myself up to this kind of woo-woo stuff. I actually want to try and almost strike a balance. Is there permission to do that? Is that allowed?
Thinking about it, there's a distinction too between like thinking about it, doing a Google search versus like allowing it in. So let me explain what I mean. When talk about memory, for example, when you're memorizing something with a memory technique, you want to create an association. So like if I'm memorizing your name, Neil, I want to come up with something that I know that either sounds like Neil or a Neil I already know, and attach that, connect it to you to remember you. So, for example, I could think of Neil Armstrong, astronaut. I could think of kneeling down, like on your knees. I could think of like nail rhymes with Neil. So in that sense, I'm thinking about, oh, what's the best answer here? Do I use nail? Do I use Neil? Like my mind is thinking, trying to do a Google search. What's the best answer? That's the mind. But there's a better way. And I teach this to people. I call it the ink blot method, which means like you've seen those Rorschach tests. You see a blurry image and you immediately blurt out the first thing that comes to you. Okay. We want to do that with memory too. So if I see Neil, boom, I think of Neil Armstrong. Boom. Like that's the first thing. So I use that because it downloaded in. I'm not going to filter it out with my mind. I'm not going to judge it with my mind. I'm not going to perfect it with my mind. And I'm going to use that. So there's two different ways. There's doing a Google search, thinking. What's the best answer? What's the best answer? How do I do this right perfectly? That's the mind. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's a better way of allowing something to come into your mind and playing off of that. That's more of a contemplative state where you're open, something comes in. Do you see the difference? And how if I trust that, you call it right brain, you call it heart, you call it whatever you want, download, trust that intuitive, creative side more and more and more, you're going to see how powerful you are. And you can see how slow and sluggish and limited that's perfecting mind. Because the more you stay in this like Google search type of mind, like perfect, the more you're going to overthink, the more you're going to try to figure out the best answer, the more you're going to spin in this mind. And so that's the example I like to give people. It's like you can use your mind. Your mind's great, right? But let's not like stay in it forever because it's very judgmental. It's very critiquing. It's very perfectionist. It's very much in that structure of ego, trying to do the best it can. So I'll give that example for people to ponder and to look at and to try to experiment with, to try to get them more to see that there's power in this more intuitive, more etheric, more woo-woo type of like ability, which we all have. We've all channeled ideas in the shower. We've all downloaded ideas. We know what we're talking about here. But this is more of a way to give people an appreciation for it.
So I've got a question for you then, John, because it is something actually that I've experimented with actually over quite a few years. So I do a lot of presentations, I do a lot of talks, I do a lot of webinars. Obviously, I do the podcast. And a lot of the time, I go in consciously now very unprepared for that absolute reason that I am now trusting that it's not going to be me actually doing the talk. It's not going to be me. Yeah, I've got a title and I've got a few slides because, you know, the host of the event or whatever has asked me to do that. So there's something to see on screen. But I will just rock up and I will say whatever actually arrives. But that's taken me a long, long time. I mean, we are talking a long time. Obviously, the first presentation I ever did, and I can remember it to this day, it was so over rehearsed. It was ridiculous. It was so poor in terms of quality because, as you say, if I forgot a particular word, it's like, oh no, where am I? Where are my speaker notes? Shuffle, shuffle, shuffle of the paper. That feels so alien to me now because I often actually, when I'm doing talks, and I can actually then recognize and actually listen to myself doing the talk, and I'm thinking, who on earth is speaking here? His name's Neil, and he's there up on stage, but I'm actually listening to myself speaking, thinking, where's this coming from? I have no idea. And I'll say stuff that I don't actually either think I know, or clearly it might be sort of slightly subconscious, or it is actually tapping in, and let's use the word here with a lowercase c, channeling something from somewhere else. But it has required a lot of time, I guess, and a lot of trust that I don't turn up with speaker notes now. Is this about practice, 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 or is this something that somebody listening to this could literally just switch on and begin to do? Or is it going to take them a lot of time?
Yeah. Great analysis, what you said. It is channeling. Like we all channel. With a lowercase c, I like that. There's two ways to do this. And everyone comes at a different, with different cards dealt, with different things in the way, right, of their mind. Some people like you and I were very paralyzed and needed it to be perfect, right, to put us in a category. And some people are more open and, willing to, able to tap into that easier, right? There's the way of the mind, again, using the mind as an example, forcing yourself to do this, forcing yourself to go on stage with notes, forcing it, right? There's that way. Or there's the inner way, the release way, right? Realizing that if I'm trying to do this and I feel an anxiety about this, then I'm leaning into that sensation to crack open that suppressed emotion, to let that intelligence pour over me, to overcome those barriers by dissolving the polarity of the heart of the emotions, right? So it's a process that doesn't make any sense to some people who are listening, right? I get that, because it doesn't make sense to your mind. It can't. Your mind can't fathom that realm. Or there's the forced route. Maybe you and I initially did the forced route, like forcing yourself to do it, forcing yourself to use note cards, forcing until you were able to tap into it. But really, the reason you're tapping into it was because you were doing heart work without realizing it. You were getting more and more comfortable with those negative, uncomfortable feelings. This is really simple. The higher the tolerance and the safety you have with those negative feelings, the better off you will be. The more you can immerse yourself and allow those things to happen instead of resisting them, the quicker you'll overcome these blockages and be able to tap in. But I like the word that you said, trust, right? The only way to trust is to build a relationship. Like, if I started dating someone today, well, I'm married, like, I'm just going to give you an example. If you started dating someone today, how do you trust them? You need time. You need to be with them. You need to, right, to build that trust. You don't immediately trust. I mean, maybe you do, but trust happens through relationship, through intimacy. Same thing with your emotions. The more you lean in and allow and see for yourself, trust comes from seeing that everything that I'm saying is working. You're feeling expansive. You're tapping into this more. That's where the trust comes from.
I can just imagine now people thinking, I want some of this. It just feels too powerful to kind of deny myself almost. And I want to use your phrase that you've eloquently used a number of times here, lean into this. How can people take the next steps? I mean, you've got a lot of programs, a lot of sort of guidance and much wisdom to offer people. How can they tap into that?
Yeah. My big thing is I want to teach people how to do this themselves, because you don't need a therapist. You don't need a priest, right? You can do this, everything I'm teaching you, on your own innately. And I can guide you through that. Like, I could guide you through it, or you can do it on your own. Everything, listen to this podcast a few times and try it on your own. But you're going to realize very quickly that your mind will not get out of the way. That's the hardest thing for people. Like, okay, I get a lean into emotion. I get feel emotion. But now my mind is in the way. Like, how long do I have to do this? I got stuff to do. I can't do this anymore. Is this working? Like, your mind will not shut up. So I guide people through a 3-step process to do this on their own. For the 3 steps are: have a fully optimized nervous system, because we're holding in all these suppressed emotions with tension in our nervous system and our bodies. So I teach people how to release that, to optimize. Second is the unhooking method, which, how do I release this voltage as it's happening? And third, catalyst merging, which is the big boulders of our life that are still haunting us, visible, invisible. How do we release those without digging in our mind? When you do that, you start releasing and integrating massive amounts of suppressed energy. So to answer your question, the best place to start is at releasepanic.com/free, where you can download a free guide talking about this emotional release versus the mental process to get you started. And then I do offer an 8-week program for people who are interested beyond that point.
Such powerful stuff, John. It really is. And I think the way that you're describing it, it feels very accessible for everybody, whether or not you identify as being somebody who has, significant anxiety. Maybe you are recognizing you have panic attacks, all the way through to people who think, actually, that really isn't me, but I'm curious about some of these things because I know, if I'm being really honest, I've got stuff from the past and it
Yeah.
would be really interesting to explore it. So I guess we're all on that spectrum at some point, aren't we? This is for everyone. It's not just for people who are really suffering at the moment, is it? This is something that, even if you feel very happy with life, we've all got stuff in the closet that we can uncover and work with, haven't we?
It's funny you mention that, because most, if not all, the people I work with don't have panic attacks. They're people who are like, I just need this. And so I'm in the process of rebranding this, because I talk a lot about anxiety and panic, but it's really for everyone to release, to integrate more capacity for potential, right? And so this isn't for everyone, meaning I think at this point people can hear the devotion that's needed to this, meaning there's mainstream methods and tools and tactics for the mind out there, and you're welcome to keep trying those. But ultimately, you're going to run into a wall with them. And if you want to continue those methods, great, beautiful, no judgment. Like, this is not for those people. This is for the people who realize there's limitations in the mind and all these techniques, and they want to go deeper and do the things that we're talking about.
And I'm really hoping that people will do this, because even though I've scratched the surface on my little journey, it is a fascinating insight into self and actually just becoming a more aware person. And I think, whichever route, as you say, that people choose to take, there is a lot of kind of uncovering and awareness and joy, really, that you can find either from deep within or from this channeling with a lowercase c, which is going to be our little mantra from this conversation, I think, John, isn't it?
Yeah.
John, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for all the ideas and all the thinking. And I'm going to go away and reflect a little bit now on my next steps, I think. So really grateful for your time today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Neil. Appreciate it.